Welcome to Brewing Kombucha. Today we're going to be talking about using honey in your kombucha brewing process. So I often get a lot of questions about whether or not you can use honey in your kombucha brewing process. And in short, my recommendation is to use it during the second fermentation phase instead of the first fermentation phase. And I have a couple of different reasons why that's the case. So for first fermentation, what you're doing is you're inoculating sweet tea with a bacterial culture. So that bacterial culture is called a SCOBY. It's a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast that live within a pellicle and within starter liquid, or basically super strong kombucha that's already undergone first fermentation. If you want more details about how to undergo first fermentation, or if you want my kind of basic kombucha recipe, definitely check out my video on first fermentation. I'll link that video down below. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to assume that you're familiar with the first and second fermentation processes. And so the unique kombucha culture, so the bacteria and yeast in the kombucha culture itself, actually feed on plain white cane sugar and tea. So that's what it uses as its nutrient source. Honey is also a sweetener. It has a different chemical composition than plain white cane sugar, and therefore most kombucha cultures actually can't properly digest or process honey in the same way that it processes plain white cane sugar. There are a lot of kombucha brewers out there who have actually, reached out to me and told me, oh wait, but I actually can use my kombucha culture with both sugar and honey, and I have not had any issues with that. So to you, I'll say everybody's kombucha culture is different, and I have actually heard of certain types of kombucha cultures that can use either honey or plain white cane sugar. So if you happen to come across one of those SCOBYs, or if you've been testing it out with your own SCOBY and you haven't found any issues with doing that, then by all means, continue to use honey in your first fermentation process. But I will say that the main reason why I'm hesitant to use honey, unless it's an experimental batch and unless I have extra backup SCOBYs on hand in case something happens to go wrong with this batch, is because honey actually has naturally occurring antibacterial and antimicrobial properties. And because there is beneficial or good bacteria and yeast in this kombucha SCOBY that doesn't actually take well to being exposed to certain levels of honey which has those antibacterial properties, essentially what you might be doing to the SCOBY is killing off certain strains of good bacteria and yeast that naturally live in the kombucha SCOBY. And so if you're concerned about the long-term viability of your SCOBY, my recommendation would be to not expose it to honey, just because even though it may ferment a few batches and you might not notice any issues with it, it might taste fine, it might still be carbonating perfectly, those issues may not show up immediately, but could weaken the SCOBY over time if it was exposed to honey in a previous generation of kombucha brewing. And so that's why I recommend keeping honey out of the first fermentation phase. Now, if you're interested in using honey during second fermentation, once you're ready to bottle this first ferment, you can go ahead and remove the pellicle or the SCOBY, remove some starter tea to make sure that you have enough of that starter tea to use as liquid to get your next batch of kombucha going. And then at that point, if you're interested in using honey because of its health benefits or because you really like the flavor of honey, then I would say go ahead and use it during second fermentation. Use it as a flavoring. It pairs really well with flavors like ginger and lemon. It pairs well with a lot of different fruits. I tried a strawberry honey flavor at one point in the past and it was really delicious. And so I am a huge fan of using honey as a flavoring during second fermentation. And a common question that I get is, well, if you are okay with using it in second fermentation and honey still has those antimicrobial properties, aren't you essentially killing the bacteria and yeast in that second fermentation bottle? And to that, I'll say possibly. I don't think it's eradicating all of them. So if it's one of those things where you have to weigh the pros and cons of, if you really want something that tastes like honey, then it might be worth it for you to use it as a flavoring during that second fermentation phase so that you can actually get the delicious taste that you're looking for. I don't think it's killing all of the yeast and bacteria. So the reason why I'm more okay with using honey once you're in the bottling phase, once you're in the flavoring phase, is because at that point, those bottles are just going to be consumed. You're just going to go ahead and drink them. You're not planning on using those bottles to create future batches of kombucha. Whereas if you are brewing with honey in the first fermentation phase, that means that you have now contaminated that pellicle or SCOBY and contaminated that starter liquid with honey, as opposed to just the cane sugar that the kombucha cultures actually use to eat and survive. That's why I like to have that separation there. Again, if you're interested in experimenting, definitely go ahead and experiment to see if your SCOBY is one of the kinds that actually does well and doesn't experience any negative effects from being fed honey. But if you are really interested in using honey during the first fermentation phase, if you really don't want to use cane sugar and you're just interested in honey for its health benefits, or because you just really like the taste of honey, then I recommend looking into a Jun kombucha SCOBY. So that's spelled Jun, and it's a completely different type of culture. It looks very similar to the kombucha, like a plain kombucha pellicle or SCOBY, but it's different in that it actually thrives on green tea and honey as its primary food source. So the main difference between a kombucha SCOBY and a Jun SCOBY is that a kombucha SCOBY will basically thrive on plain white cane sugar and any type of tea, as long as it's true plain tea from the Camellia sinensis plant, not an herbal tea. And then a Jun SCOBY will thrive on green tea and honey as its food source to ferment. So even though they look very similar and they produce very similar looking outputs, they actually are very different cultures. So if you're really interested in using honey for first fermentation and you really want that flavor to be carried through and you don't want to just use honey as a flavoring in second fermentation, then I highly recommend that you look into getting a Jun SCOBY that's actually intended to be processing and digesting honey properly. And I have a whole video that walks you through how to brew a batch of Jun. It's actually very simple and very similar to brewing a regular batch of kombucha, but I'll go ahead and link that video down below if you're curious what that process looks like. I'll also share a link to where you can purchase a Jun SCOBY. I'm often asked by folks if you can train your kombucha SCOBY into becoming a Jun SCOBY over time. Say if you've like slowly introduced it to honey and try to train it to get used to digesting honey. I haven't done enough experimenting to know whether or not you can successfully do that, but if I end up doing that in the future, I will definitely film a video and I'll definitely update you on the results. I just want to make sure that before I recommend any procedures to try to convert a regular kombucha SCOBY into a Jun SCOBY, that it doesn't have any long-term negative impact on the actual SCOBY itself. So if there are any harmful effects on the SCOBY that resulted from using honey, you may not actually realize that those effects have happened until several brews later. I'm really looking out for kind of the long-term viability of a culture of a SCOBY, more so than just like one brew or two brews out from having used honey. So I'll definitely update you if I have any more information or if I have any experiments that are successful with turning a kombucha SCOBY into a Jun SCOBY. But in the meantime, I just recommend finding a dedicated Jun SCOBY because they are readily available online. And so I can share some recommendations with you on how to find them. And then also definitely check out my video on how to brew Jun if you're interested. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions or are curious about other topics related to kombucha brewing, definitely check out youbrewkombucha.com. Happy brewing!